Welcome to part 3 of a 4-part series about the Eclipse of Darwinism. Enjoy.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
The other morning I sat in my writing chair and wondered how I wanted to kick this episode off. Sometimes the openings come easy. I might use a clip from a movie or an interview that's relevant to the topic, or I might dive right into the subject. As this episode is all about the early 20th century theory of mutationism, I considered using an X-Men angle. After all, Wolverine, Jean Grey, and the rest of the group are all results of modified genetic traits that expressed themselves in unique ways. Unanticipated mutations in the genetic code. And then I saw the turkeys. From where I sit, the window looks out upon my backyard. About 30 feet from the house is a 200-year-old family cemetery. Not my family, but the farmers who once lived on this property. It's small, surrounded by a rock wall, and beyond that is a few acres of woods. For the last couple of years, turkeys have roosted in the trees behind the house, and in the morning they come down to look for food. There's usually no less than 20 at a time, sometimes more. I still pause what I'm doing to watch them. Large animals in nature never cease to capture my attention, and we have an abundance of them. We've seen deer, bear, and foxes, as well as smaller animals too many to mention. All the result of gradual change over time. At one point, in the distant past, each of these creatures went their separate ways from their original group and evolved into their present forms. That evolution may have taken a few thousand years, or even a few million. The wonderful diversity of species outside of my window where I sit to write every morning at 4 a.m. is nothing short of amazing. Charles Darwin had these same thoughts when he went on his morning and afternoon walks. He had a favorite path that he would take called the Sand Walk, and he spent hours contemplating his ideas while the birds sang and the leaves fell. His theory of natural selection made perfect sense to him. It was brilliant and beautiful in its simplicity. Yet there was one thing that eluded him. It was one of the hows. He had the how when it came to the proliferation and evolution of species. Nature selected those organisms which were slightly better adapted than their competitors for resources. But how did they adapt? What, for example, accounted for a rabbit's ability to evade capture or the diversity of colors in moths and butterflies? Those adaptations provided benefits. What natural event caused the changes required for nature to work with? It was a problem that Darwin would always struggle with. It was the one gap in his theory. And because of this, there was no shortage of alternative theories ready and willing to fill that gap. Enter mutationism. And what exactly is mutationism? Charles Darwin proposed slow, gradual changes in species that eventually led to a split. Once the split occurred, the species would continue to evolve, branch off, and evolve some more. When you step into a forest, you're walking into the results. Every tree, every vine, squirrel, and termite evolved into what it is today from a common ancestor billions of years ago. It didn't happen suddenly. It happens so slowly as to be imperceptible, at least when seen through our eyes. We have very short lifespans. Mutationism takes a different approach. Instead of slow, gradual changes, mutationists will tell you, a new species pops into being. But how? Mutations. Darwin wasn't privy to the idea or the notion of mutations in his time. Nobody was. But the idea of the sudden appearance of new species wasn't new. In the early 19th century, decades before Darwin's On the Origin of Species, Etienne Geoffroy St. Hilaire wrote in 1822 that new species can happen instantaneously. The idea was known as saltationism, and Darwin was well aware of it, although he didn't consider it as a true alternative to his own theory of natural selection. After his death in 1882, it popped up again in Materials for the Study of Variation, treated with a special regard to discontinuity in the origin of species. a book by English biologist William Bateson published in 1894. In it, Bateson acknowledges the theory of common descent, although he's quick to point out that it has yet to be proven. He then presents two main theories supporting the idea of common descent. The first is Lamarck's theory of use and disuse, that organisms change in response to the pressures of their environment and pass those changes on. The second is Darwin's theory of natural selection, involving variation, adaptation, and inheritance. What Bateson saw as a glaring omission by Darwin, and not so much by Lamarck's theory, is the cause of variation. While Bateson does not use the term mutation, his observation of mutations in nature led to his idea that sudden changes do occur. Like saltationism, these changes could be significant and beneficial to the organism. It need not be, as Darwin suggested, a slow and gradual accumulation of small changes. Bateson was also the first to use the term genetics in 1906, although he actually used the term genetically when referring to all living creatures being genetically connected in his 1894 book. As I said, the term mutation hadn't yet been coined when Bateson wrote his book, but it wouldn't be long before it was. In a 2-volume treatment called The Mutation Theory, Dutch geneticist Hugo de Vries introduced the term in 1900. After observing sudden mutations in the evening primrose years before, de Vries came to the conclusion, as had Bateson, that changes can happen suddenly, and Darwin's gradualism wasn't the primary method or pace of evolution. This idea fascinated American biologist Thomas Hunt Morgan. Originally, Morgan wasn't impressed by Darwin's theory of natural selection and slow changes. He didn't feel it accounted for the complexity seen in nature, nor did he see how it explained how changes, even accumulated ones, could result in an entirely new species. On top of this, Darwin never explained or seemed to know the underlying cause. It wasn't until his own work with fruit flies that Morgan began to see how small mutations could be acted upon by natural selection, how they could be inherited and accumulated. In a weird twist of fate, Morgan, once a Darwin denier, helped lead the way to the understanding of genetics and inheritance, and eventually the synthesis of Darwin's natural selection and Mendel's genetics. I'm sure Darwin would have been impressed and relieved that the gap which had for so long bothered him had been filled. Now, did that mean the death of mutationism? Well, not quite. Well after the modern synthesis of natural selection and genetics became the accepted engine driving speciation, along came German-American geneticist Richard Goldschmidt and his 1940 book, The Material Basis of Evolution. Goldschmidt, echoing the sentiments of the past, felt the Darwinian explanation sorely lacking. Microevolution, or the small steps provided by small variations, even accumulated ones, couldn't account for the evolution of one species splitting into two, according to Goldschmidt. Instead, he said it was macro mutations, or the single-step transformation of one to another, and that being the solution. He called these macro mutations, or the result of them, hopeful monsters, and his theory became the hopeful monster theory. How was it received? Was Goldschmidt's theory ever vindicated? No, it wasn't. But he wasn't completely off target. Big changes in an organism can be affected by a small number of genes. In a 2008 journal, British biologist Olivia Judson published an article titled "The Monster is Back, and It's Hopeful," and another one in 2010, "Evolution, Revenge of the Hopeful Monster." And both those articles gave examples of speciation that show Goldschmidt's theory isn't without some merit. It won't change the course of Darwinian evolution, but it does show that nature is a strange place and does a lot of strange things. There's one thing I do want to point out. Mutationism, or sudden leaps in change, should not be confused with the theory of punctuated equilibrium as proposed by American biologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. As punctuated equilibrium suggests, for most of the time, species tend to remain in long periods of stasis and undergo very little change. When changes do occur, it seems to result in a period of rapid evolution, or seemingly rapid evolution. But this isn't a single-step change, nor is it rapid in the sense that it happens quickly and observably. What punctuated equilibrium says is that some changes may take thousands of years instead of millions or billions, which, in the grand scheme of things, seems fast. The fossil record is evidence of this. It shows these long periods of little change with sudden bursts of variation. As Stephen Jay Gould put it,
although speciation isn't overnight, it would seem slow by the scale of our lives. It may take thousands of years. Thousands of years compared to the millions of years of subsequent stability is a tiny fraction of 1%, so that even an event, that is the branching of speciation, which would seem slow by the scale of our lives, in geological parlance is instantaneous. And that's the punctuations of punctuated equilibrium. So punctuated equilibrium argues that in geological perspective, evolutionary change is concentrated in geologically sudden, but actually slow by the scale of our lives, bursts of speciation, and that stability is the norm for species in between. That has a lot of implications.
As for the periods of stasis,
successful species don't go anywhere. They tend to be stable.
And that's a good place to be. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material and also ways to support this show at evolutiontalk.com. And please visit the support page if you value this show. Links to get there are in the episode notes, and you can also find ways to contact me at the site. I'd love to hear from you. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.